In order to understand the contemporary reality of parliamentary sovereignty, we need to turn our attention to two very important themes. Now, these themes relate to the impact of European Union law on the United Kingdom and also to the Human Rights Act, a theme that we can link to the effect, the impact of the law, the European Convention of Human Rights on English or British law. What I'm going to do is, first of all, deal with the concerns that we have in relation to the law of the European Union. Now, what is our main focus of argument here? What I want to stress is that if we're thinking about parliamentary sovereignty and its contemporary reality, we need to look at those instances where the sovereignty of Parliament appears to have been limited. Now, this takes us, of course, directly to the issue of the law of the European Union. When the United Kingdom joined the European Union, it wasn't called that then, but let's use that language now anyway, it was necessary for Parliament to pass an act to allow the law of the European Union to have effect in British law. Because remember, the whole idea of the Union is that it is a single supranational organisation with a single body of law that applies in London, it applies in Berlin, Paris, etc. So the very idea of the Union presupposes that Union law is supreme. In order for this to happen in the United Kingdom, Parliament had to itself pass an act, it had to legislate. The act was called the European Communities Act of 1972. Now, let's just think commonsensically about what is happening here. Parliament is saying in the EC Act of 1972, the European Communities Act of 1972, in those areas where European law takes precedence, is supreme, the power of Parliament is now necessarily limited. Does this mean that we're looking at the end of parliamentary sovereignty? Well, this is a complex question. Looked at one way, and going back to one of Dicey's important rules for the understanding of parliamentary sovereignty, we could say that no parliament is capable of binding a successor. So the EC Act of 72 is certainly not binding on a later parliament that would choose to withdraw, and this is a real issue in British politics, would choose to withdraw from the European Union. Presumably, at least in theory, all it would require is a new piece of legislation which would repeal that old act, the EC Act of 1972, the effect of which would be that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union, which would then mean that those areas where European Union law claims precedence or is supreme vis-à-vis UK law, that would no longer be the case. The UK would, if you like, this is the language the commentators used, would have repatriated its sovereignty, would have reclaimed its sovereignty. So it's as if the sovereignty that was, if you like, given away in 1972 could equally be taken back if a parliament so chose. Now, this, I suppose, goes back to our understanding of what Dicey means. Can Parliament legally do this? Well, presumably it can. Parliament can change any law that it wants. So it could change the law of that made the UK part of the EU, just like it would change any law at all. Would it do this? Well, this takes us to what is politically possible, and that begs all kinds of questions about what is going on in British politics. In order to illustrate these themes a little more, I want to look at one of the most important cases in this area. And this is the ruling of the House of Lords in a case called Factortame. I can't really go into the facts because they're complicated, and I think the point that we need to think about can be done if we look at the following quotation from Lord Bridge, from Lord Bridge's ruling in the case of Factortame. In other words, this is an important precedent case for our understanding of the nature of parliamentary sovereignty since the United Kingdom joined the European Union. So this is Lord Bridge speaking, quote, "If the supremacy within the EC, the European Community, of community law over the national law of member states was not always inherent in the EEC Treaty, the treaty that founds the European Union, it was certainly well established in the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice long before the UK joined the community. Thus, whatever limitation on its sovereignty Parliament accepted when it enacted the EC Act of 1972 was entirely voluntary. Under the terms of the 1972 Act, it has always been clear that it was the duty of a UK court when delivering final judgment, to override any rule of national law found to be in conflict with any directly enforceable rule of community law. Similarly, when decisions of the Court of Justice have exposed areas of UK statute law which failed to implement council directives, Parliament has always loyally accepted the obligation to make appropriate and prompt amends. Thus, there is nothing in any way novel in according supremacy to the rules of community law in those areas to which they apply, and to insist that in the protection of rights under community law, national courts must not be inhibited by rules of national law from granting the appropriate relief, the injunctions, etc. In appropriate cases, it's no more than a logical recognition of that supremacy. Okay, so what is Lord Bridge saying here? Well, in part, I suppose my point that I made slightly before I read out that quotation was based on Lord Bridge's analysis of the situation in this case, because he refers here to, if you like, the voluntary surrender of sovereignty when the United Kingdom joined the European Union. And it follows from that. Lord Bridge says that these principles are either there within EU law or the treaties that found the EU, or they're in the law created by the European Court of Justice. So Parliament, crudely, knows that it is doing this. Parliament is voluntarily surrendering its sovereignty in those areas where the EU claims competence. And it clearly follows from that that if there are inconsistent provisions of national law, inconsistent with reference to EU law, then a court, a British court, must disapply those provisions. It must give effect to European law, not British law. Now that's constitutionally revolutionary, as I hope you appreciate. What we have here is EU law taking precedence, overriding, if you like, inconsistent provisions of national law. But that's basically because Parliament has said so. In passing the EC Act of 72, Parliament has effectively instructed the courts to follow this course of action. Now, it's a very important ruling. It's not Lord Bridge in factotum, it's Lord Denning in a case called Bulmer and Bollinger, where Lord Denning comes up with the very striking metaphor that the law of the EU is like a tide flowing up the estuaries, flowing into Britain, and mingling, if you like. The law of the EU is a water that's flowing and mingling with the rivers of the common law to produce, if you like, a single body of law. And I think this would be an accurate way of thinking about it. There are, I suppose, certain political factions within the United Kingdom that see this as a subversion of sovereignty, a problematic issue, the invasion, if you like, of foreign law into common law, the surrender of sovereignty. All this is the kind of language of British politics at the moment. I think probably more properly it's thought of as a mingling of legal traditions. Moreover, if you cast your mind back to when I was talking about legal families and the distinction between common law and civil law, because the law of the EU comes out of civilian European traditions as much as common law traditions, then the point I was making then was if we go way back, then we find that the common root is Roman law. So I think it would actually be quite false to think of this as an invasion, to think of it as the blurring of common law principles by civilian principles. There's always been an interchange between the United Kingdom and the continent, and that's true of its legal traditions in the 1100s, the 1200s, and in 2013. I think Lord Denning is accurate in trying to break down this idea that we have one form of law that somehow invades and changes the common law, and what we have is in fact a mingling, a combination of principles. I'm sure other people might argue differently, but I would cite Lord Denning as one authority that really says we can't afford to think about the relationship between EU law and common law as oppositional. These things are flowing into each other. These are part now of a merged law, and of course will remain so as long as the United Kingdom remains within the European Union. That goes back to the uncomfortable fact of parliamentary sovereignty. If a parliament chose to withdraw, then there's nothing in theory that would prevent them doing this. It may lead to a constitutional revolution, but that's anybody's guess. I don't think we can seek guidance from the cases on what would be the situation then. But it would seem to be, if we had to conclude at least on the issue of sovereignty in the light of EU law, there has been a voluntary surrender of that sovereignty, a limitation, if you like, of the sovereignty of Parliament in the areas where the EU has supremacy, and that will remain so for as long as the United Kingdom remains within the European Union.